Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the PAWA Education Series. The last time we met, we were talking about capitalist society in general. Today, Comrade Ian Beddows is going to tell us about how the capitalists obtained their capital. Over to you, Comrade Beddows.
Thank you very much. Greetings to everybody who is listening. It's commonly believed that the capitalists obtained their initial wealth because they were more careful with what they had than most of us, and therefore saved their money. Here's what Karl Marx had to say about the primitive accumulation of capital. That is, accumulating the huge amounts of money needed to buy factories and machinery in order to start a business. This is what he said. He said, in times long gone by, and by the way, he's being sarcastic here. In times long gone by, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite. The others, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell except their own skins. And from this original sin dates the poverty of the great majority, that despite all its labor, there's up to now nothing to sell but itself, and the wealth of the few that increases constantly, although they have long ceased to work. Then he says, such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in the defense of property. In actual history, it is notorious that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, briefly force, play the great part. Many Africans see Britain and the USA as the guardians of democracy and human rights because of the image portrayed by the international media, which is under their control. We will now look at the real history, especially of Britain, and how the ruling class of that country first gains its wealth. Why Britain? Firstly, it was the world's first capitalist country, and later the first and most important imperialist country in the modern capitalist sense. The USA is its offshoot. Secondly, capitalism was introduced into Africa through conquest, and Britain was the biggest colonizer. I'll add a third one, and that is, I'm talking to people who are now, for the most part, living in Britain, who've come from Zimbabwe and other African countries and now working in Britain. So they should know something about the country in which they're working, and also the relationship to the countries to which they've come from. In part one, we talked about the expulsion of the peasants of Britain from the land, thus creating a working class. Now we need to look at, number one, the use of piracy against the Spanish. The Spanish were looting the people of the Americas of their gold. That was in turn stolen by the English pirates. This happened, by the way, at the end of the 16th century, going into the beginning of the 17th century. Two, the West Africans or transatlantic slave trade. Three, the plunder and subjugation of India. And four, the sale of opium to China, leading to the Opium Wars. So we're going to do parts 3 and 4, sections 3 and 4 in part 2B, which will be next week, because we've got enough to chew on when we talk about piracy and the West African slave trade. For this week, anyway. Piracy. The idea that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492 has long been debunked. Not only were the millions of Native Americans, wrongly called Indians, already living there, but other Europeans as well as Chinese and even West Africans had visited the Western Hemisphere in earlier years. We now know that very clearly. What is true, though, is that the voyage of Columbus marked the beginning of European colonization of the Americas. This process had a major effect on the development of capitalism. The Spanish were the first to colonize the Americas, though the most important early explorers, Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci, were Italian, and the name Amerigo was to become the root of the name America. The Spanish invaders discovered gold being used for many purposes, mainly decorative or ceremonial. Often it was alloyed with copper. In that form was used for practical everyday items. It was used extensively by the Aztecs in what is now Mexico and by the Incas in now what is Peru and Bolivia. In part one, we talked about the four main centers where civilization first developed: Mesopotamia, Iraq, the Nile Valley, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Pakistan, and the Huanghe Valley, China. These civilizations have historical continuity with the present. We also mentioned how civilization also developed independent in the Americas, and particularly in Mexico and Central America, and in what is now Peru and Bolivia in South America. There were also advanced cultures in North America, by the way, but European conquest put an end to most of what those civilizations had developed. That is apart from food crops, which, as we mentioned last week, they provide a lot of our food, including maize and potatoes, which I think you're very familiar with. Less admirably, they gave us tobacco and coca leaf, from which modern humans learned to extract cocaine. Now, over the centuries, gold in Europe, Asia, and much of Africa, through gold coinage, had become the main means of exchange. The plunder of the Americas then gave the growing money economy an influx of gold, initially from the plunder of gold artifacts, that is, things made of gold, then by gold mining using the local people as slave labor. Silver, too, was in abundance and used as a secondary currency. We talked, by the way, of the pound sterling, which was based on silver originally. And I just want to say we will study the use of gold as the universal equivalent in a later part of our program. Huge quantities of gold were shipped to Spain, but on their way, English privateers, that is, pirates licensed by the King or Queen of England, would steal from the Spanish what they had stolen from the indigenous people of the Americas. And even now, I believe some of the people of South America refer to the English as pirates. At the time of Spanish colonization in the Americas, Spain had only just finished driving out the Islamic Moors who had colonized Spain for 1,000 years. The Spanish ruling class was very feudal and militaristic in its attitude, and was mainly interested in extravagant, conspicuous consumption. And I think we need to think of some of our African leaders who are, rather than invest money which they've gained, would rather flaunt it, living what we now call a bling existence, with lots of gold and fancy cars and big houses, but not really developing anything, not even as capitalists. Anyway, let's carry on. In contrast, England was developing as a trading nation. In part one, we saw how the new aristocracy had started breeding sheep for wool during the 16th century. The trade, not only in wool, but in woolen cloth and finished products, made the growing bourgeoisie, the merchants and master craftsmen, prosperous. Wealth accumulation, rather than extravagant consumption, especially in the early stages, was a mark of British capitalist development. So what I'm saying, if you like, slightly contrary to Marx, was some of these guys did save, but they didn't save money that they made through their own industry. They made because they ran the peasants off the land, and they took away the opportunity of others to make a living from their own industry. So when we talk about property in modern terms, private property, that private property is almost always property which has been taken away from others. I just want to make that point. Britain is surrounded by the sea, and British sailors proved far more successful than the Spanish. When a huge fleet known as the Armada set off from Spain in 1589 to invade England, it was utterly destroyed before they could reach land. This marks an early phase in the development of British maritime and military supremacy. Before the Armada, Spain was the dominant imperialist country in the world. By the way, Portugal also not only exploited Africa, but Portugal took Brazil. That's the biggest country in South America actually became under Portugal. Now, the influx of gold and silver into Europe hastened the development of capitalism, and the activities of the English privateers, the licensed pirates, gave an impetus to the development of British capitalist trade supremacy. Now, to the West African slave trade. It was the command of the fleet which destroyed the Spanish Armada, John Hawkins, who in 1555 became the first Englishman to carry slaves from Africa to the Americas. In ancient Greece and Rome, slavery was the dominant means of production, and almost all the slaves were European. Those slaves who were used for work in the mines were frequently worked to death. We must never imagine that people simply accepted slavery even in ancient times. There were numerous slave revolts. The most famous was the Spartacus revolt from 73 to 71 BCE, named after its leader Spartacus. The slaves were defeated after coming close to capturing Rome. 6,000 were crucified along the main road known as the Appian Way, including Spartacus. Nevertheless, history tells us that the treatment of slaves in the Roman Empire improved from then on. By the way, you'll find a very good movie made in 1960 called Spartacus. And I think any trade unionist, any person who's class conscious would like to watch it. And our hero, working class hero, was crucified almost 100 years before Jesus. But by the way, that was Spartacus. Very nasty death. And we can go on to that discussion later, but normally it took not 3 hours to die, but normally around 3 days to die on the cross. A very nasty death. The Western Roman Empire, with its capital in the city of Rome, fell finally in 476 CE. But the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, was to last until 1453 CE, almost another 1,000 years. In 293 CE, the Roman Emperor Diocletian divided the huge empire into West and East for easier administration. And in 330, the Emperor Constantine made the ancient city of Byzantium the second Rome and changed its name to Constantinople. Constantinople was captured by the Turks, a people coming from Central Asia in 1453. The Turks established the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was defeated during the First World War, 1914 to 1918, and modern Turkey was formed. The city of Constantinople is now called Istanbul. So slavery continued in the Byzantine Empire, but it was not the main mode of production. Feudalism was dominant, but slaves, mostly used for domestic work by the very rich, continued to be captured, especially from the surrounding Slav people, Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, and Bulgarians. Hence, the word slave in English is derived from Slav, because the people who were commonly slaves were Slavs. The Turks continued to buy slaves mostly from the Tatars of the Crimean Peninsula and the Black Sea. The Crimean Tatars spoke a similar language to the Turks, had a similar culture, and shared the Islamic religion with the Turks. They captured and sold Russians, Ukrainians, and Caucasians to the Turks until well into the 19th century. From the 16th century, pirates from the North African coast, from modern Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, raided shipping in coastal towns and villages of Europe as well as West Africa, enslaving people of different nationalities and ethnic backgrounds up until the early 19th century. It is estimated that around 1 million people were enslaved this way. Slavery, then, the ownership of one human being by another, was an institution which was in existence across most of the world, but slavery had not been the dominant mode of production anywhere since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. However, the transatlantic slave trade was on a scale far bigger than anything since ancient times, and was to give a huge boost to the development of capitalism and the primitive accumulation of capital by the rising capitalist class. The first recorded taking of slaves from West Africa by Europeans was by Portuguese in 1441. This was before the discovery of the Americas by the Europeans in 1492. These slaves were used mainly in Portugal itself, but with the colonization of the Americas, there was a huge need for labor by the new plantation owners, which increased the demand for slaves. The Portuguese were the biggest slave traders, with most of the slaves going to Brazil. They were followed by the British, Spanish, French, Dutch, and Danish in that order. Over the course of 400 years, it is estimated that around 12 million Africans arrived in the Americas by slave ship, and that around 2 million more died on the way. Many, many more died in Africa, either directly through the slave raids or by the social disruption created by the raids. At least 90% of the slaves were captured by other Africans, with only the Portuguese on the record as often capturing slaves themselves. When European slave traders fought slaves in West Africa, slavery was already established there, often because the enslaved person was indebted. In many cases in Africa, enslavement was not handed down to the following generation, though. People could not be born into slavery. As the Europeans demanded more slaves, so the supply of those who had been enslaved under African traditional law declined, and the ruling class of whole kingdoms started deliberately to capture others. The kingdom of Oyo, Igala, Kabu, Asante, Benin, Dahomey, Manikongo, and the Aro Confederacy being among them, being the most important. Despite John Hawkins trading slaves in 1555, the involvement of the British in the slave trade did not really take off until the establishment of the Royal African Company by the British royal family in 1660. First named the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading into Africa, and at first focused on search for gold, by 1663, it had changed its focus to slaves. Its first governor and the biggest shareholder was the Duke of York, who was to become King James II in 1685, following the death of his brother, King Charles II, who was also a major shareholder. And by the way, a little bit more on British history. Let me just come in there. The British merchants, small traders rose up against the aristocracy in 1640. And by 1649, they publicly beheaded the King Charles I at that time. And for 11 years, you may not know this, Britain was a republic, or England was a republic. Scotland was separately governed at that time. England became a republic known as the Commonwealth. And by the way, Commonwealth properly means a republic. So the Commonwealth of England survived till 1660. Then there was a counter-revolution. King Charles II, son of King Charles I, came back. They didn't have money. They'd lost all their money. They need the means to make money. So the Royal Africa Company, first of all, looking for gold and then for slaves, made the British royal family rich. And it retains a lot of that riches today. Now, slaves were branded on the chest with the letters D.Y. for the Duke of York, or later with the letters RAC for the Royal Africa Company. Now, this will horrify you, perhaps. Some were branded Society for those slaves belonging to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Places. So the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, a Christian organization belonging to the Church of England, actually owned slaves and branded them across the chest with the word society. Anyway, when in 1688 and 1689, the unpopular King James was deposed, his daughter Mary II became joint monarch with her husband, William III, the royal shares were passed on to them. It is recorded that between 1662 and 1731, the Royal Africa Company transported 212,000 slaves, of which 44,000 died on the way. It should also be noted that in 1666 was the year of counter-revolution, which is what I've talked about already. From 1603, Scotland and England shared the same monarch, but they had separate administrations. Anyway, what I've come on to, I already spoke about before. By the time the formation of the Royal African Company, Britain had already acquired land in the Americas, both on the North American mainland, where British colonies were later to become part of the USA, and further south in the islands of the Caribbean and adjacent parts of the Atlantic Ocean, namely Bermuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, and Jamaica. Other territories were added a little later. As sugar and tobacco plantations were established, convicts and indentured laborers, mainly from Ireland, initially were sent to work them. Then I explain what were indentured laborers. Indentured laborers were forced under either the terms of criminal conviction, so they used a lot of criminal convicts, or because they had signed a contract, commonly for 10 years, to work under slave-like conditions. But the difference between them and slaves was that once their term was over, they were set free. Some African slaves were also employed on the sugar plantations at this early stage, especially in Barbados. But the development of the slave trade and massive began with the RAC. Between 1680 and 1686, the RAC transported around 5,000 slaves every year. It was a growing merchant class which deposed King James II. They wanted an end to royal monopolies and they wanted free trade. Even today, free trade is a popular cause among big capitalists who want to repeat by some left-wingers who imagine that freedom is the freedom of big capital to do as it pleases. In 1689, the free traders of Britain obtained what they had fought for. As Eric Williams, who later became the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, asserts in his important book Capitalism and Slavery, written in 1944, in 1698, the Royal African Company lost its monopoly and the right of a free trade in slaves was recognized as a fundamental and natural right of Englishmen. So the right to trade in slaves was seen as a fundamental right. In the first 9 years of free trade, Bristol alone shipped 160,950 Negroes to the sugar plantations. In 1760, 146 ships sailed from the British ports for Africa with a capacity for 36,000 slaves. In 1771, the number of ships had increased to 190 and the number of slaves to 47,000. The importation into Jamaica from 1700 to 1786 was 610,000. And it has been estimated that total import of slaves into all the British colonies between 1680 and 1786 was over 2 million. The profits from slavery were immense. British ships served the Spanish colonies with slaves too. Excuse me. And to make maximum profit, the ships were loaded as tight as they could be. It was common practice for each slave to be given a space measuring 5 foot 6 inches, that's 1.68 meters, by 16 inches, 41 centimeters wide. Chained 2 by 2, right leg and left leg, right hand and left hand. Each slave had less room than a man in a coffin. Not surprisingly, many died of disease on the way. Bristol and Liverpool were the two biggest British slave trading ports, and Eric Williams records. About 1713 Bristol, it was estimated that on a fortunate voyage, the profit of the cargo of about 270 slaves reached 7,000 or 8,000 pounds. Now imagine what that is like in modern money. It's probably more like 7 or 8 million, at least hundreds of thousands, exclusive of the return from ivory. In the same years, the net return from an indifferent cargo, which arrived in poor condition, was over £5,700. Profits of 100% were not uncommon in Liverpool, and one voyage netted a clear profit of at least 300%. The Lively, fitted out in 1737, the cargo worth £1,307, returned to Liverpool with colonial produce and bills of exchange totaling £3,080 in addition to cotton and sugar remitted later. And 18th century writers estimate the sterling value of the 303,737 slaves carried in 878 Liverpool ships between 1783 and 1793 at over £15 million. As with ancient Rome, people did not accept slavery easily. In every part of the Americas, there was a significant population of African slaves. There were serious slave results with slave owners being killed. These revolts and the danger of slave owners and their families played through the slave owners and their families played a large part in the ending of slavery. In 1791, at the time the French Revolution started in 1789, slaves in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture. Captured by the French, Toussaint died in prison in 1803. But on the 1st of January 1804, the Republic of Haiti was declared by successor Jean-Jacques Dessalines. So this was the first modern African country, if you like, or country with Black Africans to actually gain independence. And they did it through their own resources. In Jamaica, slaves ran away to the forested mountainous areas in the center of the island. These became known as Maroons. By the 1740s, the British forces were forced to recognize the autonomy of the Maroon communities. So they also became relatively free. Of course, slaves were not a commodity like food or clothing, used for personal consumption. Slaves were mainly tools of protection. In the West Indies, sugar was the main commodity produced, and in Virginia, tobacco. Sugar Sugar cane had been grown in India for some centuries, but was hardly known in Europe, where the only readily available sweetener was honey. During the course of the 17th century, 1600s, coffee coming from Ethiopia by the way of the Arabs started to become popular in Europe, as was cocoa coming from Mexico and tea from India and China. Sugar gained rapid popularity as a sweetener for the increasingly popular hot drinks and the making of sweet cakes and puddings. The triangular trade grew between Britain, West Africa, and the Americas. Manufactured goods went out, especially cloth, cotton, linen, woolen, and even silk. Cooking utensils, tools, and weapons were also exported, as well as trinkets of all kinds, which were exchanged for human beings. Slaves were then sent to the Americas, and sugar, tobacco, and later unprocessed cotton came back to Europe. The trade also built up the huge reserves need to build factories and put the steam-driven machinery, which by the final years of the 18th century were taken over from water mills driven by running water. A number of banks were formed on the basis of the slave trade. I want to listen to this carefully, but the one which remains today is Barclays. In 1756, members of the Quaker faith, and the Quakers later became staunch abolitionists, David and Alexander Barclay became involved in the slave trade and also earned a large plantation in Jamaica. The later success of Barclays Bank is mainly due to the accumulation of capital through slavery. Cotton had been discovered and used for cloth production independently in South America and Sudan at least 5,000 years ago. By the second half of the 17th century, India had developed the cotton industry and was exporting huge quantities of cotton cloth to Europe. This challenged local industry, which produced woolen and linen products. Linen has similar qualities to cotton, but is more expensive to produce. Towards the end of the 17th century, small quantities of cotton were grown in the British West Indies, but the breakthrough came a century later when in 1793, the American Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which removed the seeds from the cotton itself. Previously, this laborious task had been done by hand. This invention led to the rapid growth of cotton plantation in the American South, which relied on slave labor. The bulk of this cotton was shipped to Britain. Some cotton had earlier been sent to Britain from the West Indies and even from India, which was becoming increasingly under the control of the British East India Company, which we will talk about in the next historical background. In 1721, British government passed the Calico Act, which forbade the import of calico cloth from India. Cotton cloth was made using traditional spinning and weaving techniques produced in increased quantities in the course of the 18th century. Later in the century, new machinery and steam power took over and the Industrial Revolution began in full force. I just want to mention here that we mentioned earlier the wool industry in Britain, which was the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution in a certain way for the historical beginning. So because of the skills of weaving and spinning from wool, others turned to cotton. They were able to learn from the wool and others went on to cotton. Machinery, though very efficient, was expensive. So where was the money to come from for the machinery? From the banks. Where did the banks obtain their money? From the slave trade and the profits from sugar grown with slave labor. In addition, where was the British peasants? Between 1760 and 1830, the peasant farmers of England, Scotland, and Wales were systematically deprived of their land, leaving them with nothing but their labour power to sell in order to survive. People come from the age of 7. Earlier machinery was driven by running water, and the factories known as mills were placed close to the river. From around 1785, steam began to replace water power. By the middle of the 19th century, the 1800s, cotton goods became Britain's biggest export. Now, that steam machinery is very expensive. Where did the money come from? From the banks. The banks got their money from the slave trade. It is true that an important factor in driving British industrial supremacy was the development of technology, which put Britain far ahead of other nations which were still spinning and weaving by hand. The other factor which gave Britain supremacy was the accumulation of gold from the Americas and India through direct theft, the deliberate destruction of the Indian cotton industry made through the activities of the British East India Company, the profits from the slave trade and the slave-grown sugar, the development of cotton plantations manned by slaves in the southern states of the USA, the eviction of the British peasant from the land, and extensive use of child labor in Britain. By the way, some of the child labor was actually slave labor because the orphan children were sold to factory owners and they were used for certain tasks, and when they died, they just got more orphan children. These then are some of the major factors in the primitive accumulation of capital by the British capitalist class. The capitalist class of other European nations and the USA have their own sordid stories of primitive accumulation. Thank you. That concludes what I have to say for this week.
Wow. Thank you so much, comrades. We do have a few people watching, so maybe some would like to ask questions. But I'll stop the recording now and then just allow people to ask questions freely. Thank you so much for that one. Let me stop recording.